Dame Rosalyn, you've been associated with the faculty and some of its personalities for over 50 years, and I hope you'll be able to provide some reminiscences of your time in Cambridge in the 1950s. Away from Cambridge, you've had a very illustrious career in international law through your time at inter alia Chatham House, the London School of Economics, and the International Court of Justice. A common thread is an enduring link with and a profound knowledge of the United Nations. So I hope that we can explore all of these avenues and then come to some thoughts on your published work. So could we start by talking about your early years? You were born in 1937 in London.
Yes, I was, shortly before the war, yes.
In what part of London?
In North Kensington, in an area which at that time my mother was dying to get out from, but which today is regarded again as very desirable, you know, the way these things go round. So it was a road called Kelfield Gardens, just off Ladbroke Grove, and it was a bit too near Wormwood Scrubs, so it was an area of great interest to the Germans to try and knock out the ack-ack at Wormwood Scrubs.
Very interesting. And could you give me some background of your family details?
Yes, I don't have anyone in the family in law, absolutely no one, and indeed I was the first member of my family to go to university, and neither of my parents had the chance to stay at school beyond 13. So I'm often struck when I hear these great legal families from generation unto generation, how different my story has been. Both my parents were very intelligent. They just didn't have the chances I was to have, and for which they encouraged me in every way. My mother did not have a job, but all her life wished she had had the chance to be a doctor or a lawyer. She watched every program on TV in these two areas. My father was a bookie, a bookmaker, initially starting very, very small, but eventually becoming the partner with Joe Correll in Correll's Bookmakers, which are really one of the big three, and of course a public company. So he helped build that up from nothing, and they were absolutely splendid people. He was straight as a die, wonderfully honest man with a strongly developed sense of ethics and what was right and what was wrong. I remember my son, when little, said to him after some escapade or other, but how do I know what's right or what's wrong? And my father said to him, if you don't want to tell me about it, it's wrong. Which I thought was a great answer.
So when the war broke out, you were only 2 years old. Where did your family live during this time?
Like a lot of Londoners, we had an evacuation during the phony war, and when it seemed it wasn't happening, we came back in time to be hit with the real thing and went away again. So during the so-called phony war, I was evacuated with my mother and my sister. I put it that way because my father was on air raid duties and that sort of thing in London, to somewhere I now see in the context of the Somerset Levels, to Wiveliscombe near Bridgewater, on a farm there. And I remember that as a perfectly agreeable time. And then we went back to London. Then, of course, the real bombing started, and then I was sent off with my sister, just the two of us, my mother feeling at that juncture. She was very torn between being with her little ones and with her husband. We were sent off on one of these trains where you stopped at a certain destination and people came and chose you as evacuees. So we went to Aberdare in Wales, and of course I was terribly nervous. Someone would want my sister and not me, but apparently the policy was not to split siblings, and we were taken up by Di the grocer, so we were never hungry or wanting. I like to think my deficiency in maths is due to the fact maths was being taught there to me at that young age, but I think it's probably due to other things.
So you didn't suffer any of the sort of privations or deprivations because of rationing and so on?
Well, we didn't at that juncture. Of course, we did come back before the end and were in the bombing, and being where we were, virtually houses all around us were being got. And I'm talking now about the buzz bomb era. So, you know, we did have a shelter at the bottom of the garden, and we always started the night not there, but when the air raid warden went, we all took a dive for that. And I remember we grew up the outside of it tomatoes, and we were certainly for a long period without any windows and just had boarding up. There was no point putting windows in, they were going to get blown out again in a day or two. And I had shrapnel in my neck, all the usual things that happen to kids in London in that age. But I can't say we were ever hungry. I don't remember that. Of course, when you've not had certain foods or food, you don't miss it. And I remember after the war, my father coming back with a coconut. I had no idea what it was. So we were all given a slice of that, and then he and my mother went out somewhere, and I, being the really wicked young person I was, I then tucked into the coconut. I was so ill, and I've hated coconut ever since. So your first school was the Burlington Grammar School? Really My first and only. I was, I think, for about a year. My sister was already at Burlington, and for about a year I was started at, this is terrible, I'm having a little blank, but it was the local convent school. And of course, we were a Jewish family, not a Catholic family, but the nuns were very nice and said no, they understood. There were certain things I wouldn't join in. But one day when there was some religious activity going on, I came back in tears on the doorstep, and my mother said, "What is the matter?" And I said, "Why can't I be in whatever it was? I'm London like the rest of them." And at that juncture, she thought it was time to try and get me into Burlington. But they were jolly good teachers, so I learned to read and write well, and punctuate from a very, very early age, and I put that down to the nuns.
Any inspirational teachers that you remember from both the convent and Burlington?
Certainly not the convent. It was much too young. There are three teachers who stick in my mind at Burlington Grammar. they'd never had anyone at university, so it was an ordinary, lovely grammar school. Our English teacher, Mrs. Halliday, really made you interested, you know, in the metaphysic poets or whatever we were reading. And as we got older, she used to invite us round on Sundays to her place for poetry readings and things. That was special. And then my history teacher, to whom I think I owe a great deal, a woman called Miss Huston. I got a great interest in history, and she was the one who said to me, because I had no idea what I should do, she said, I think you could be good at law. Why she said that, I've no idea. I'd never thought of law, but I owe her that great debt. And then there must have been an infinitely patient physics teacher, because I really am rather poor in the sciences. I say this with some shame, but it's so. And she endlessly went over and over and over things with me, and never said, you stupid dumb girl, you know.
Very interesting. So it was at this point that perhaps the seed was sown for studying law.
Well, it definitely was, because she said this in the lower six. So, absolutely.
And that was perhaps what made you decide to study law when you went up?
Yes. I mean, I'm very struck today that youngsters usually know what subjects they want to study, and they know what universities have exciting courses in them. I mean, I knew none of this. This was all a sort of unknown world to me. So she said, I think you'll be good at law, and I liked her enormously, so I thought, right, you know, law, whatever it is, we'll have a go at that. And the school more generally seemed to think it worthwhile for me to try for Cambridge. How that came about, I really don't know, but obviously I'm hugely indebted.
And that was why you chose Cambridge?
So, yes, that was what they suggested, nowhere else. And so I did the Cambridge exams. Entrance then was by exam. And it was quite clear on the history paper that I hadn't covered a great deal of the syllabus. It was clear that my Latin was somewhat shaky, which was why in the event I was advised to do economics in the first year to avoid Roman law. And but there were papers that gave you scenarios, you know, and what would you do and who do you think was legally right, this sort of thing. And apparently I was quite good at those, and got the invitation.
And when you arrived in Cambridge, what made you decide to go to Girton?
I've been trying to remember that, and I cannot remember. I simply cannot remember. Well, it will have been a tiny choice then.
Yes.
Because there was, I think I must have an answer. There was Girton, there was Newnham, and there was Old Hall. Old Hall was sort of not quite established, and I did have a look round Newnham, and it all seemed a bit dreary to me. So nothing more rational than that. But my law tutor there, the woman actually who'd looked at my papers and seen a glimmer of hope in me, was Marjorie Holland. Do you remember her? Marvellously eccentric person. And she was married to the great Harry Holland, the legal historian. They lived separate, but I believe entirely friendly lives. And she used to drive around in her old Daimler with the window wound down enough for her cigarette holder to come out a good foot on the side.
Wonderful.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, they both sort of become quite legendary. And
Yes.
I know the house that she used to live in. It's a beautiful limestone building
Right.
on the
Yes.
Madingley Road.
Right.
Yes.
Yes. He was quite a frightening figure, but, a daunting figure. But after exams, her law people all used to be taken for a sort of afternoon tea and ice cream with him. I remember being almost as frightened of that as the exams, but it was meant very kindly.
So, when you arrived in Cambridge, Dame Rosalyn, did you find this was quite an adjustment, a small town after London?
Well, not that, because I led, fairly circumscribed life in London. I wasn't let at age 18 into all the joys of London. I'd led, I suppose, a rather local life. I was, of course, very anxious that everyone else was going to be much, much cleverer than I. And I remember having this same sort of sensation when I arrived at the court, and then you think after a week or two, well, I am going to be able to swim, I'm okay here.
Very interesting.
And I loved it, I loved the whole 4 years I had there. Wonderful.
In Cambridge.
Yes.
Must have been such a different place to the Cambridge that it's become today.
I suppose so. But it was opened all sorts of doors and wonders to me.
Would you cycle from Girton to
Yes,
the
I'd never
faculty?
been on a bike before, so I was forever crashing, dislocating my shoulder, this, that and the other. And although I did it for 3 years, I've never felt very safe on a bike, so I haven't biked in Holland, though so many people do there.
Right. So, still, your time at Cambridge, there were several very illustrious professors in place, and one of them that I wanted to ask you about, Dame Rosalyn, was Professor Hampson. Did you ever come across him?
No, of course I knew of him, but our paths didn't really cross at all. I was looking through the list you sent along, of course. Clive Parry was one of the international law professors, but never mind, so we knew each other by sight. And several of the others you've mentioned, Armitage and so on. I knew of them, but I didn't really know them. Robbie Jennings, of course, and Ellie Lauterpacht, I did. And Kurt Lipstein, Bill Wedderburn, though I got to know him much more when he came to LSE, when I was at LSE. Tony Jolovitz, I've mentioned Ellie, and Geoffrey Wilson. I have no idea what became of him, but we saw quite a bit of each other in the sense that he was kind to certain students.
Your fellow students included Professor Allett, as he is now. Do you have any memories of him?
Oh yes, and we've remained in touch over the years. We were that year, honestly, we were a fairly bright bunch doing the LLM. But of that bright bunch, there were two, I think, who were exceptionally bright, Philip Allett and Andrew Jacobides. Everyone finished up getting first, but they were the people you thought of as the starred person. And Philip, as you know, is a real one-off, different from everyone else. But they've all become good friends, and Owada, who I was in touch with my memories as an undergraduate and not in the LLM program. We have been friends all those years, but life took him different ways. But then when I was increasingly doing UN work, whenever I was at the UN, he would invite me to whatever was going on. Yes.
Kept in touch with them.
We kept in touch,
yes.
And I think of Awada as a long, long friend. Philip, I'm intermittently in touch with, but we're still in touch. Andrew Jacobides is a very attentive friend. He went off at an extremely early age to be Cyprus ambassador to the UN, an ambassador in Washington, and all sorts of grand things. And he still is very good about sending an email saying they're coming through London and can the four of us get together, So I see him maybe in London once or twice here and in New York whenever I go. And the person, of course, Steve Schwabel, you asked, when did I meet him? He was a very close friend of Ellie's, and I met him actually in that capacity. Ellie was very kind to the LLM students. We'd go over there once in a while to his place, and he introduced me to Steve Schwabel. And I somehow remember that Steve gave me a call in London in the year he was over there, and we went up once or twice to concerts. It was before either of us was married, and we've been firm friends ever since. So the four of us, that's my husband who you've briefly met, and of course Steve's wife Louise, we are all in close contact, I would say. I see them several times a year because they travel a lot, and I think I can fairly describe myself as Steve's campaign manager when he was president. So Steve Schwabel, who's still astonishingly active in arbitrating, engaging in all sorts of things, he's over in Europe frequently, and we're in very close touch. But the person we've not mentioned, who was very important to me in those years, was John McMahon. And John McMahon, who was among the earliest of us to have articles published in places like the British Yearbook. He died, he got a job at the UN in the legal office, and he died. So that was truly awful, but we were very, very close during that graduate time.
Tragedy. And I think that you were one of the editors on a book, a dedication to him.
That's right, yes.
Gosh. Yes.
But, he was certainly one of this group.
Yes. Very sad.
Yeah.
Dame Rosalyn, I noticed in your Who's Who that you were in 1958 a UK intern at the UN Office of Legal Affairs. So this was during your time at Cambridge?
Yes, it was at the end of the first degree and before coming back for the second degree, which was then the LLB, and it was a BA in law, all very confusing for other people. And it was, I think it must have been a 3 or 4 month appointment. I cannot remember who told me to have a go for it, I'm afraid. But I did, and I remember there were all sorts of letters and forms and this and that. And the 2 finalists were then a young chap called John Birch, who later, I was lucky enough to get it, and John later went into the diplomatic service. I remember he was ambassador in Hungary, and I'm sure he's done all sorts of other wonderful things, yes. So I didn't happily feel I blighted his life, which I wouldn't have liked to have done.
So, following your graduation, you undertook a PhD in United States, your JSD.
If I can just jump back and say that internship was really important in my life, because I really started to learn and understand about the UN. I started to see very clearly there are often several points of view on a given subject, that scheme worked, that there was one person from each of the applying countries, and you were put into the department applicable to your studies. So I went into the law department, and I met Oscar Schachter, who was to become a lifelong friend, yes. Yeah.
Very interesting. We'll come back to him when we talk about your published work, because he's featured as a reviewer, a very favourable reviewer of some of your work. When you were registered at Yale, you were funded by a Commonwealth Fellowship, and I wondered how this came about. Was it somehow linked to your association with the UN Office of Legal Affairs?
I know I went through university on the first year on, what do they call it, a state scholarship or something, and after that I was lucky enough to get some college scholarships, so all of that was paid for. And then are we still talking about the UN internship, or have we moved on?
Your time, if there's more to say, but
no,
otherwise...
they provided obviously a bit of money for that.
Right. And
I
then,
tell you something else, I didn't know how I was going to get there and back. There was this wonderful scholarship. And I remember writing to Ellen, and he was running the International Law Fund, of which I'm now co-trustee with him, James Crawford. And he said, I think I can find you a bit of money if you're fair. So
very interesting.
Very indebted to him for that.
And you then went across
I was
to...
then able to take it
Did you go by you flew?
No, I know, I went by sea.
By sea.
That was the way it went those days.
Well, it must have been a lovely journey.
Oh no, the North Atlantic is never a lovely journey. Horrible. But it got me
Gosh. And while you were doing your PhD, you fell under Professor Myers McDougall, whom you've formed a very close relationship with.
He and later on you ask about mentors, and really Ellie's been I'll answer that question when we get to it, but those two have been really, really important in my life. And I remember I had a Commonwealth Fund Fellowship. I think at that time they were called Harkness Fellowships and then changed their name. And but it was up to me, as I remember it, to identify where I wished to go. So I started at Yale and at the other place, and of course it was lovely going to Boston and meeting everyone there, but I didn't come away feeling this is it, you know. But then I went on to Yale, and I was immediately brought under the spell of this extraordinary man, Myers McDougall, who anyone would tell you was just sort of astoundingly charismatic, argumentative, strong personality, but if you were in his favour. It was a very special world, and he was the one who taught me, which I still believe to this day, that international law is not about rules. Rules are things that can't be gainsaid, like there are 15 members of the Security Council. That's a rule. But most of the norms we talk about, self-defense or aggression, norms that can be invoked, but whether they apply or not depends upon a whole swathe of things. And it was he who taught me that astonishing fact which no one had ever suggested in Cambridge. I mean, I had wonderful teaching in Cambridge, but there'd been nothing outside the black letter law. It was just what it was all about, you know. And Mac is someone that if he takes a shine to you, he does his best for you all your life and his.
Fascinating.
Yes.
And this position that you adopted there, you've remained true to throughout your career.
Yes.
Yes.
And a lot of people said, you know, how you can't understand him, he has his own special language. I remember a bizarre article in the British Yearbook by Philip Allott, who is great but not the easiest person to read. And Philip wrote an article saying, Miles McDougall, you can't understand anything. And I thought, talk about the popcorn kettle black. But I always felt this was an excuse. If you put your mind to it, you could understand it. I thought it was people didn't want to, you know.
Very interesting. Dame Rosalyn, what would you say were the highlights of your time while you were at Yale? Looking back, I should maybe just ask you first, it must have been a very different world to Cambridge.
Yeah.
You know, sort of still suffering perhaps to some extent from the privations of war and so on. A much more...
I remember being astonished at the fullness of the shops. I'd never noticed the shops weren't properly full. But when you went to the States and saw the supermarkets, that was astonishing. So I do remember that. I find it hard to put a highlight on it. You know, I lived in a dorm there, except when I came back from my internship. At that stage, you were all meant to live out, so I did that, and that was fun too. And I made some good friends, and the Harkness, the Commonwealth Fund, part of that was to provide you with a car to travel in the summer. So that was quite extraordinary. And they provided me with this enormous Chevrolet, any car you ever seen in England. And, you know, off I set with 3 of those chums to go all around the States, and that was with their blessing, is what they wanted you to do. So that was really special to travel all around the States that way around.
Gosh, you're sort of from Eastern Seaboard.
Eastern Seaboard going north.
Right.
And then across, and then, yes.
Right across to the west.
Oh, the west.
Dame Rosalyn, your future husband, now Lord Higgins, was a lecturer in the economics department at Yale in, I think, 1958 to 59. Did your time there overlap with his?
We met each other in Cambridge. He is actually 10 years older than I am, and he had been running when a young man, I mean running at a very senior level. He was in 2 Olympics, and he was in the next race after the 4-minute Bannister Mile. He says no one was interested in the next race. Everyone got up and went home. But I mean, he was running at a very senior level, so he came up to college late. But we were part of a circle of friends there. And then he was going across to take up his... Willie Fellner, the economist, had seen good things in him and asked him to come and lecture there. And he was going across to take up that. And I was going across to take up my Commonwealth Fund Fellowship. We were both on, as I recall, the Queen Mary. And that's when we got to know each other rather better. And but then I came back to do my master's and the year he was teaching. So it took us rather a long while to finish up together, yes.
And when you were married in 1961, was that in the States?
No,
or
that was
here.
Yes.
Right. So, do you have any reminiscences or memories of your time at the Brookings Institute?
Not a great deal. I think it was a fairly short stay, and it was, how to go on working over the summer. I don't believe I made any special friendships. It was a sort of office and a place to work, yeah.
Did it give you some insight, further insight into the workings of the United Nations at all?
Not honestly the United Nations, but a bit of Washington, because now for the first time I was living for a few months in Washington.
Right. Someone whom I wondered whether you met during that time was Professor Bowett, because he at that time...
I can't remember when we first knew each other, but I think he published, wasn't it, in '64, his book on peacekeeping, and we must already have known each other, or he must have seen my early writings, because he asked, would I do a couple of chapters for it.
Right.
So I would say, the early 60s probably. But that was here.
Here?
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
He just happened to be in the UN legal office from 57 to 50.
I didn't come across him there. I did, of course, come across Oscar Schachter and others, but don't remember him from there.
Perhaps, as he was at the time, Mr. Stephen Schwabel, he was a lecturer during your visit to the States. He was at Harvard from 59.
But my contacts with him were not at Harvard,
Oh, right.
No, they were, as I've said, through Ellie, and we were friends, yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, Dame Rosalyn, you returned to the UK, and in 1961 to 63 you held a London School of Economics fellowship, and I wondered whether you used this time to write up your PhD.
Exactly, you got it in one. Yes, yes, I did.
Which brings us then to your first position, which was a very important time in your professional life, your job as a staff specialist at Chatham House from 1963 to 74.
Yeah.
I wondered if you could tell us something about Chatham House as an institute.
Yes. I think it's changed, obviously, inevitably over the years. At that time it took pride in hardly accepting any government funds. Now I imagine it somewhat depends on them. It was a very happy time there. They had a director of studies whose name I wish I could remember. If it pops into my head, I will tell you. I have the feeling it begins with an E. But he was extremely encouraging in everything I did. Would pop into my room saying, well, good things in the future. All of that was very encouraging. Everyone went down to the canteen at the same time for morning coffee, and you met other people there, and the way it worked then was if you were a staff fellow, you were meant to assist in digging out answers for the corporate and individual members who'd write in, or phone. They wanted to understand something about, the UN expenses stuff or something like that, and then I'd be the one who'd do the paper for the answer to be given, and other people would be doing the same in their areas. You were meant to give occasional lectures 2 or 3 times a year in your area to all of those who chose to come in the wide membership. And then you were meant to be writing something important. So that was when I was able to get my head down and do at least the first 2 of my, maybe 3 of my peacekeeping books.
Right.
Yes.
Yes. Well, I noticed that it seems that you wrote 5 books during your time there.
Oh, I wrote the little bodily head one. It's very interesting because I've just been asked by Nyhoff in the light of Ukraine and all of this, can they republish it? And I firmly said, no, it's so superficial to think those things had anything to do with what I was writing about. But you're right, I did that. That was a sort of moonlighting venture. It wasn't on the Chatham House programme, but I did do it.
So it seems to me that you were actually encouraged to write. You were given it was...
Oh, that was what you were there for.
Yes.
To write, to answer members' questions, and to give occasional lectures.
Did your role change? Were you given more responsibility?
No, that was what a fellowship was.
Yes,
yes,
I understand.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so it meant that during that period, I just had my salary and the work I was doing then didn't require research assistance or enormous sums of money. They were all produced within the confines of my salary.
Right.
Yes.
And during
changed there too, hasn't it?
It was during this time that your husband became an MP. That was in 1964.
64.
Yes. And I wondered whether you helped him in his election campaign.
Well, I have always supported him, as he's always supported me. And I would take an unpaid 3 weeks off from whatever I was doing to go and assist in elections down in the constituency, and that must have been true of the first one. They did understand, Worthing, that he had a working wife, and so I wasn't there every week at tea parties and things of that sort, but I was there for the big functions, the hospital fete and things of that sort. And of course, because I knew a bit about the UN, the UNA, they used to ask me down, so it was that sort of thing.
Very interesting. So he retained his seat for 30 years.
Yeah.
And did this mean that you still lived in London?
We did, mercifully. Luckily, we were living on the south of London, at Blackheath, and of course now it's so much easier to get there, but you then had to come up to London and get a train down, or if you drove, there weren't yet motorways. So every 200 yards there were roundabouts, so it took about 3.5 hours to get there. But compared with other members, it was near London. So Terence, that was the relevant thing. Terence was able to be a good parliamentarian and look after the constituency very well. So he was there a few times a week,
Professor Allett was... before I ask you that, during this time, Dame Rosalyn, you became Vice President of the American Society of International Law. So this would have strengthened your existing links.
Well, I must say it was I imagine Oscar Schachter, who told me, while you're over here, get involved, because he jointly supervised my PhD on the development of international law through the political organs of the UN, which came out as an OUP book soon after I came back. And I think so he was obviously the legal director of the UN legal office. I'm sure it wasn't Miles McDougall who said become a member. I'm sure it was Oscar who said get involved, become a member. And I did, and I've always felt very close to the American society. You know, even when I was a young person, they treated me as if it was a pleasure for them to have me, you know, not the way around it should have been, and everyone was always so kind. And over the years I've held various posts there, and I love going.
And had chances to attend the annual meetings?
Absolutely, and to be invited to do panels, because once my book on the development of international law through the political organs came out, that became a hot topic.
Right.
Law making by political bodies, and so I was invited to do papers on that, for example. Yes.
During this time, Professor Allett was actually the British secondary visiting legal advisor in New York, and I wondered whether in your first years at Chatham House you had you came across him.
I must say, I don't remember that. The Foreign Office at that time had one or two international lawyers' days in which all the academics would be invited to go along and talk with the FCO legal staff about the big legal issues of the day and the positions the FCO was taking. I know I ran into Philip there, and we loved those days, but I don't remember otherwise. Philip may have told you a different story, but I can only tell you what I remember.
So after 11 very productive years in which you produced 5 books, you decided to leave Chatham House, and I wondered what made you...
It's a very simple answer. When I went there, the director was Kenneth Younger, who was a wonderful... He'd been a Labour minister, and he was a wonderful internationalist, and I felt, I flourished under him. Then came... My recollection is that he retired before he died, that's my recollection. And then came Andrew Schonfield, who was of course very well known as a newspaper economist for the Observer, and a very interesting and warm and outgoing man. Really all his interests were at that time EEC interests, and he wanted Chatham House to focus on all of that other thing. So I knew it was time to go.
Right. So you went back to the London School of Economics, where you were a fellow for...
I mean, this was really treading water while I tried to see what next.
Right.
Yeah.
But, so your role during that period at LSE...
That was in the International Relations Department, and I was... International Relations at LSE has always had international law as a compulsory course, and at that time they had a special course for non-lawyers. The first thing I did when I got to LSE as the professor of international law was to stop that and say the international relations people have to do a proper course on international law. Noddy course is no good.
Right.
But then I was teaching what I later pejoratively referred to as the Noddy course. I don't think I probably felt that at the time, yes. And then I was beginning to think about the bar, if I've got the sequence of events right, I think so.
Yes.
I'd started doing a lot for mobile North Sea matters, which you mention here. And petroleum law was being made as it went along, really.
Must have been a thrilling
It
time,
was a thrill.
in the North Sea.
It really was. And you had to have you had to have some skills in taking what you knew in law, but seeing how it could apply to something quite new, what could be built, what could be done. So it was exciting. And fortunately, mobile North Sea offices were literally at the back of LSE. I mean, it was so easy to pop out for an hour when you weren't teaching, pop back. So all of that worked very well. And I became very friendly with the Mobil's North Sea Oil legal advisor, a man named Daniel Vock, and he and I have been lifelong friends, personal and in the law, ever since. He then went back to the States to do other things, and we've gone on seeing each other over the years.
Fascinating. During this time, you also taught a course, an LLM course on international law of natural resources.
No, that was later.
Later.
When I went back
as
the international law chair.
Right.
And
right.
Then, as I've said, I got rid of the special human rights course, so I taught the human rights course.
This was with
Peter Duffy.
Peter Duffy.
Mm.
Yes.
Yes, dear Peter. Yeah, we were very, very close, and he left a request for me to give the memorial address, and it was a really terrible time. But he was so knowledgeable, so capable. I brought him to my chambers, and he was outstandingly good, and he was a wonderful academic too. He was then at Queen Mary, but we did a joint course because, as you know, at that time, before LSE declared UDI, all the master's courses were university-wide.
Right. So you taught with Peter Duffy using the Socratic method.
All my courses, I've done that. And that course was about me doing, we did in the first term all the sort of theory about human rights, what is it? Is it state given? Is it natural? Is it Western? Is it suitable for the East? We did all of that in the first term. Then I did a term on all the UN aspects, and Peter, we were both there throughout the year, and Peter then led in the third term on the Council of Europe stuff, the Strasbourg stuff. Yeah.
And this technique, did you acquire it while you were at Yale?
Oh, absolutely.
Yes, is this your one of the legacies of Myers McDougall?
Definitely.
Very interesting.
Yes, when you were over there, you had been given things to read for the upcoming class. And then McDougall was absolutely ferocious in class. He didn't mind humiliating. And so we all sat there with our heads down, hoping not to be caught. But I think I more kindly did I've always taught by Socratic, and there's no point having passengers. And you may, as I did the undergraduate general course in international law, the one I changed from the Loddy course. That was open to all undergraduates in international relations. They could do it in years 2 or 3. And it was, I can't remember which year, of the law course. That I did by lectures. But I would pause and say, let me pause there for a moment. Does anyone need to ask anything, But for seminars, absolutely Socratic method. And I hate teaching where people constantly invite other people along to teach a lecture. I mean, that's just lazy teaching.
Rosalyn, before we leave the topic of your time as a consultant for Mobile. I just wondered, did you ever go visit any of the rigs at all?
That's an interesting question. I will tell you that I am one of those who has a flying problem, which in our profession is a fearful handicap, isn't it, when we move around so much. And the thought of going on a helicopter, that was just more than I could cope with. So I knew Dan Vock, the legal counsel, well enough to say to him, Dan, I just cannot do this, you have to understand. And then in later years, I'm trying to think when. Well, it must have been just before I went to the court. In one of the things you do as a barrister, I was asked by a person I still refer to as the King of Greece, King Constantine, to do, together with Anthony Lester, a case for him at the Strasbourg court, which were about his properties in Greece, which the new government was taking over, properties that had the family graves. So it's wonderful, he's now back there as a resident, so that case has led to things being much better, and all the old sores going away. But why am I telling? Oh yes, something was happening. Some drama involving Greek citizens somewhere, and I was told by the sister, so you're going on the helicopter. And I was terribly sorry, but I'm not. Just to say the truth, you know. Afraid the king is going to think I'm idiotic, this brave soldier, but I'm not.
So, still during your time at LSE, you visited Yale in, I think it was 1975?
I think I've never, well, I can say, I have never been in the States without going to Yale. I can say that with certainty. I still feel very close to Yale. And obviously when Miles McDougall was alive, I went always to see him, and in later years, as he was starting to decline in health, he used to be essentially looked after by Michael Reisman, who is an outstanding international lawyer, but Michael Reisman was like a son to him, and he would, you know, take Mac, fetch Mac, and arrange for people like me, you know, to come visit at the Lawn Club, I remember, when I was over, yes. But I did go then to teach at Yale.
I wondered about that.
Yes,
yeah.
And that was lovely to be invited back to teach.
International law.
International law, but also I was told, what course would you like to bring with? And although I've fallen into a lot of things in my life, like fallen into the law and fallen into going to Cambridge, whereas some kids today know exactly what I fell into my life. There were other things, just thinking about this morning, that I now see I've done rather deliberately. And one of those was saying to myself, I should use this opportunity in going to Yale to start being pretty knowledgeable about the European Convention on Human Rights. I mean, you have to remember, we're talking about a time where that had only been going for 15, 17 years, so you really could be on top of it.
Right.
And of course, I really think I was the first in the UK to be so interested in the UN. Well, perhaps Derek Barrett was as well, but he had many other interests at that time, the law of the sea or whatever. And so, again, the UN had only started in 45, and in 1959-60, you could still, really immerse yourself in the law of the UN. But I deliberately got that course up, going to Yale. I had already written an article in the British Yearbook, I can't imagine why, before I went to Yale, on the margin of appreciation in European convention law. And then I thought I could build on
Very interesting. That early stage.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that was sort of a deliberate career move, yes.
Right.
Yes.
Which I hope we can follow through when we talk about your time when you came back to the LSE as a professor. Dame Rosalyn, I just wondered whether during this time at LSE you encountered Professor Toby Milsom, who was Professor of Legal History.
No. I mean, I knew of him, of course.
Yes.
But I don't really think we ever knew each other. So are we essentially on
We're coming
the
to
back at LSE period? Is that right?
Yes,
Okay.
and we're now coming.
No, I don't think I did. And the person, there were two professors there immediately ahead of me, each of whom I did know. This is terrible, I'm having a blank, but the tall, thin, lovely gentleman who went off so uncharacteristically to Australia. Who am I talking about? But this is terrible, but he was really... This was a period in which I was feeling somewhat insecure in the UK. I mean, most people thought, policy and law was daft. Law was about rules, and all you had to do was know the rules and apply them, And there was quite an impatience with it all. And his first name was David. And he was at LSE, and he was really, really kind to me and encouraging. And then when he left, the person who got the chair, at that stage it was done just by invitation,
Right.
was Ian Brownlee. And of course I knew Ian.
Yeah.
Yes.
I hope to touch on him later.
But I'm afraid I didn't
Yeah.
really know Professor Toby Milsom, no.
In a way, that doesn't surprise me, because I think that he was very somewhat reclusive.
Okay.
Yes. Dame Rosalyn, you then moved to Kent, where you had a chair. You were a professor of international law.
For first year. And I remember writing to Robbie, Robbie Jones, who always took a kindly interest. Yes, Robbie sort of took the fatherly interest in me, and then Early was a friend. That's the difference, So
Yes.
I don't remember ever writing to Ellie for advice, but we've been and still are great friends. But Robbie, at that stage, I would say, what do you think?
I can understand that he would, because just from what I've had conversations with Lady Jennings,
Yes.
and she told me that he was always in favour of going away and let them call you back. And so the circumstances of your taking this position were that you had good advice, and there was an opening, and
What are we talking about?
at Kent.
At
Your
Kent,
professorship at Kent,
I
yes.
got back with it.
1978.
So I remember saying to him, what do you think? I mean, it wasn't sort of in my mind's eye in the Stella Group, though I'm now a quite active patron of their law clinic. I mean, I think they've done very well in recent years, and their law clinic gets ward after ward after ward. So Robbie said, yes, but chair is a chair. You go for it. So I did.
Interestingly,
and again, I'm sorry to interrupt, but again, it was commutable distance. We were then in Blackheath.
I wondered about that.
And I drove there each day.
Right. So you didn't have to actually move. No. I wondered about that. One of our scholars in the archive is Professor Heppel.
Yes.
And he too was at Kent
He
for
was.
2 or 3 years.
And I met him first there, I think.
Really?
Yes.
So because I think he was just about to leave as you arrived.
Right. Yes. No, but I remember him as an amiable person I met there. And Kent at that time the law was quite in a sort of left-wing fervour, but Bob was one of the saner people. And I really do think Kent's pretty good now, they've come on a ton over the years. And of course the other two people who were great chums were Brian Simpson, who alas a year or two ago died, having gone since to Michigan and to Oxford, and Claire Pally.
Right. Oh yes, she was a friend of Professor Heppel's.
Yes, probably.
Yes.
And she was a good friend of mine. And in later years, when I was out on we haven't got this mentioned at all, I think, on the Human Rights Committee, which I did for nearly 3 months a year for a period of 10 years, so I guess that should get a mention.
Yes.
Claire was out doing her shorter period on the subcommission on discrimination.
Right.
And so we used to have good times together in Geneva. And of course she was an outstanding scholar with her books on Northern Ireland and on Rhodesia.
Right. And this gave you an opportunity, Dame Rosalyn, to complete your last 2 peacekeeping volumes, Volume 3 on Africa and Volume 4 on Europe, while you were at Kent.
Them then?
I think they were published.
Recollection of when I completed them.
I believe that you published the Volume 3 on Africa in 1980 and Europe in 1981. So
it sounds as if you're right.
I hope I'm right.
I cannot remember a thing about those, which is terrible.
It struck me that this might have given you an opportunity to really work at these, which have been described by at least one reviewer as a huge undertaking.
They were a huge undertaking, and of course today you would have research assistants and all the rest.
Unbelievable.
And, so much of it would be found online. Of course then there was less stuff, but still an awful lot of stuff.
Yes, yes. Well, I'm really looking forward to covering that in your scholarly work. You left Kent for a more senior post, and that was
when
your
the chair came up. Yes.
Did it come up then?
It came up then, you see. Ian Brownlee moved to the Chichely chair.
I see.
And then the LSE chair came up.
So you applied for the chair,
Yes.
and you then were, in a way, able to take up from where you'd left off, because you'd already broken the ground at LSE.
Yes, so my second short slot there, of course, was in the International Relations Department. I was now back in the Law Department.
Back in the Law Department. So it strikes me that LSE is a very vibrant place.
That's absolutely right. And, people say, where isn't it all very Marxist? I mean, it isn't at all. There's every point of view there, and everyone very tolerant of everyone else. they used to have these wonderful fortnightly meetings. The Desai is of course Lord Desai, who's now in the House of Lords, and he was the professor of economics there. You'll know him from TV. He looks as if he's never had a haircut. His white hair is out there. And Ken Minogue, who sadly died last year, was a very right-wing Thatcherite professor of philosophy, I think. And they were great chums, and they put on, weekly debate to which all the students could come. It was wonderful.
And your role was, essentially teaching, research. Did you have quite a bit of administration to do?
Yes, inevitably, and pastoral duties. I've always prided myself on trying to look after the students, and even later when practice started to build up, I've had a contempt for those who do their practice and fit the students in. It absolutely has to be the other way around. So I loved my teaching, and but I also had, I can't remember what the name of these things was, but I think could it have been a moral tutor? I don't know. But the kids were in and out of the room with their problems. And that was where I learned you can't learn things from what they look like. There was this absolutely thuggish young man sitting out in the lectures, taking no interest at all. Maybe it was a t-shirt, but I remember it as a vest, and with a boot up and tattoos, and God, how awful. And then he came in one day wanting to see me, and his eyes welled up. He said he was homesick, So you just can't tell, can you? And then I had another homesick chap, an Indian, who came in one day to say he was really having trouble settling down. He was homesick. So I said, wondering what part of India he came from, where do you come from? And he said, from Southall. So he'd been in the Indian community by London Airport and was finding that a big enough change to the straight face. So I remember I was doing those pastoral duties and the administration that inevitably comes with a chair, and then I suppose it has to happen that when the school sees someone appropriate, they will then ask them to be on the big school committees.
Right.
So I remember I was on, I wish I could tell you what committee, with Mervyn King, who went on to become the governor of the bank. And I was always, when we reached sort of economic problems, I was always so glad Professor King was around. But I enjoyed those committees, and I was on various search committees. I was deeply involved in LSE administration. So I was doing the undergraduate course, then 4 master's courses, the human rights one, which I'm still modest enough to think was a super course with Peter Duffy, natural resources, which was International of Natural Resources, which was built up from scratch, and the first part I did all the classical international law stuff on it, and the second part I talked about North Sea oil as a resource in the international issues that arose. And then I completed the set with a UN law course, and for years the UN had been in the doldrums, and it was really only after perestroika that it started to be interesting again and active again. And so suddenly the numbers went from a handful, to a really large room. And I had to get up all the materials on those.
Very interesting. At this stage, you were also invited to deliver one of the Hague lectures, the first one that you did, and that was actually on natural resources, including property in natural resources,
That's
including
right.
oil.
Yes.
And I wondered what the circumstances were of this.
Well, those lectures you're invited to by a body called the Curatorium, who are senior international lawyers from around the world who look around and see academics who might have something to say on this or that, and they usually invite you to suggest a topic. So I suggested international law and property issues, including the law of natural resources. And again, that was something fairly new at The Hague and interesting for me, and I hope interesting for them.
This was the start of your membership of the UK committee to the United Nations Committee on Human Rights under the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights.
Yes, that was what I mentioned a moment ago. So, yes, my background in convention law, which I knew a bit from what I'd worked up for Yale and what I'd written, and listening to the wonderful Peter Duffy and preparing with him, and knowing a great deal about the UN side of it all, must have made, when Sir Vincent Evans, who was my predecessor, died, must have made HMG think maybe I could take this on. And this is, the committee, not the awful commission, but the committee under the Covenant. And Sir Vincent, who was on it from the outset, had with a group of other starters made sure the atmosphere was right. It was nothing to do with politics, Cold War issues, absolutely nothing. So that was the first time the government asked me to do anything, and I was very thrilled.
And you were on this committee for 11 years.
I thought 10, but you may be right, And and it was when I sort of got the nod for the court, I came off, yes.
So one of the sort of major undertakings that preoccupied you was to try and work on the whole question of states' reservations.
That was one of the things. I mean, there was a great deal going on there, and if you're a human rights body, you see, I'm a great believer in Myers McDougall, think of the hat you're wearing. So if you're a Foreign Office legal advisor, it's perfectly appropriate you think conservatively and look after your client. But on a human rights committee, you must try and build up the corpus of law on human rights. And so I think we did a lot of interesting things those years, including general observations, which were 7 or 8 page commentaries we draw up on particular articles under the Covenant, and matters of that sort. And then we also had a person each couple of years who'd look after new cases and get them up and running and go with them. We had all sorts of innovative things going on. It was an exciting time to be part of that committee. And of course, during the latter part, the world began to change with Gorbachev and Perestroika and all of that. So there'd been a very sort of typical Russian USSR man, and then he disappeared, and one day Rain Mullison, who is a wonderful man and a close friend who's now running the university at Tallinn, he came along, and he was, I was to learn, Gorbachev's legal advisor.
Really?
And Gorbachev, he never joined the party, and Gorbachev plucked him out of the university and said, now, your job is to make sure that whatever we're signed up to is for real. And so he had these heady few years. So he was around, and there were lots of good things going on there. I didn't answer your question. What was your question?
No.
Oh, reservations. So one of the things, indeed, one of the general comments was on reservations. And that created a bit of a furore, yes.
So, Dame Rosalyn, looking back, what do you see as the highlights of that time?
Well, and as I say, building the law. I still think what we did on reservations, of which I think it's generally known that I was the author, although it was apparently regarded as very controversial. I still think that was a good human rights move forward, and pretty sounding law. You have to be slightly, as I've said, on the margin of things in human rights law. We did, for example, David Owen phoned me one day, and he was, minister at the time, and said, let me try and get this story right. He said, we knew each other a bit, and he said, Yugoslavia is disintegrating. What are we going to do about each of the units and your committee and human rights? And I talked with Fausto Pocca, the Italian who was then chairman, and I readily say we came up with a sort of theory of international law that, along with the things that devolve when the status of a country changes, such as rivers and law relating to those, that human rights would devolve. And so we started telling the various component parts, well, this is the law, and you have now succeeded to Yugoslavia's rights and obligations under the covenant, and so you're expected for a discussion meeting with us in 3 months. And they'd say, oh yes, right, come along. And that way we got them all in and continued. None of them said, no, it's nothing to do with me. So that's what I mean about trying to build and do things.
Very interesting, particularly in light of one of the comments you made in your themes and theories in 2009. You said that when you first joined this committee, you became depressed.
I did at the beginning. I still think that the real heroes are people who work in the field. When you turn on the television and you see the ghastly things going on, and those good souls who are there on the ground trying to help with feeding operations, whatever they're doing, they are the heroes of our times. And one of the things we used to do, as well as the case law, which was very interesting, we used to do these state reports, and that required the states to come along for these discussions with us. But Amnesty International, for example, would ask me to call in if it was states A, B and C. They'd like to brief me before I went, and then I used to go back to Chatham House and get out all the newspapers over the past 5 years on that country. Their press library was terrific, and then everything seemed so unutterably awful, these terrible things going on, Yes. And just seemed terrible. So I'm full of admiration for the people who are in that full time on the ground. And I gradually learned to live with it and to find interest in the intellectual interest in the other things in that job.
Yes. It was also around about this time in 1985 that you became involved with the International Tin Council cases.
Yeah.
I wondered if you could say something about that.
Yes. I remember that when I came back from teaching at Stanford, and I taught at Yale, and then I taught, 2 years later at Stanford, was that the sequence? I've got it here. Yes, Stanford came first, and then came Yale. 75 Stanford, 77 Yale. I mean, the first thing was that the children were at that time young enough that you could take them off somewhere else for 3 or 6 months, if you were invited as a visiting professor. I mean, later obviously you couldn't. So those were opportunities to seize, and Stanford was absolutely great because constant sun, and you did your teaching, and then you all went down to the faculty swimming pool and had your barbecue there. I mean, this was just a totally different life, and the kids loved it as well. And so that was all wonderful. And I know that because during that period, as you've already mentioned, during the early to mid-70s, I was doing a lot for Mobil on North Sea oil, and every time the possibility of going to court came into view, I had to step back because I wasn't yet called. I decided this was the time to get called. So while I was fellow at LSE in the 74 to 78 period, I decided that was the time to get called for the bar. And I remember it being so grim, going back and doing subjects you had long since forgotten or had never done and had no natural aptitude for. I remember tax law and things like this. And so on top of teaching and all the consultancy work, as it then was, I then had to do all of that. But anyway, eventually it was behind me and I got called, and that's obviously been very important in my life too.
And I think I remember reading that it was your husband who encouraged you to do this.
It was. I mean, Terence, who we've met briefly, has always, and I say these last couple of years, he's agreed with me, no, I don't want to be doing that. But until the time of my retirement, he's always been, yes, you can do that, you can squeeze that in, why not do that? Which I don't think a lot of husbands are like.
Well,
and I remember saying to him, I don't need to go to the bar, I'm doing fine as I am. But it was really thanks to him that I did.
In 1991, you were invited to give another of the Hague Academy courses, and this was the general course on international law. Yeah. Which
I mean, it is a pinnacle trainee lecturer to be invited to give the general course. The general course. Ne plus ultra.
Yes. This must have been a lovely occasion, Dame Rosalyn.
It was both wonderful and awful. They give you a good period of time, they give you 2 or 3 years notice. But it is the general course, and you wonder, what on earth can you say that all of these fantastic, distinguished people haven't already said, And so you read and read and read what everyone else has said, and then you read around every topic that's in your mind. I mean, it's a prodigious amount of work. Really prodigious amount of work.
I'm greatly look forward to talking about some of your chapters which received extremely good reviews when we come to your scholarly work. I can only say that I've actually had the I'm just so pleased that I've been able to go through some of it myself, because it is a fascinating perspective that you take, looking at some of the, not going through the usual.
No, I really wanted to make it not quite the same thing. But I also don't think it's quite right for a general course, which one or two people have done, just to focus on one tiny area of the law. I don't think that's what the general course is meant to be.
Right. So, in 1993, your husband was knighted and he became Sir Terence, and this also must have been a lovely occasion.
Yes, absolutely.
Yes. Do you have any memories of it?
I just remember it was all beautiful and so, well deserved, and he's always been so well regarded in politics by people on all sides, really, Yeah.
In 1994, you produced your Problems and Processes, and then we'll come to that later. You were awarded a Dame Commander of the British Empire
That was when
in
I went to the
95.
court.
I wondered about that.
Yes,
So
that
was
when
this
I went to the court.
before you went to the court?
Well, it was just as I went it was before.
Right.
I had been nominated by the National Committee. I remember that very clearly. I remember receiving a letter from Robert Gough, Lord Gough, who was at that time chairman of the committee, saying the committee had been meeting and considering everything, wondered if I could agree to being nominated, and he knew what an upheaval it would be in going to a different country. And of course I took half a second to say yes, So I remember that very clearly. What were we on before that?
I was just asking you whether you received your
the
DBE before or after going to the court.
So
that is,
after that had happened, Frank Berman, who was the legal advisor of the day, and who is also a good friend over the years, I remember him saying, I need to come talk to you about something. I said, do you want to just clear it by phone? I remember him saying, no, I want to come. And that was very nice. And then he came to tell me this nice news that I was to be made a DBE. And then when I went to the court, I decided to break with precedent and just be Judge Higgins. So Robbie had chosen, fair enough, everyone makes their own choices. So it was Judge Schwabel, Judge Bejawi, and then it was Judge Sir Robert Jennings, right? But I said I just wanted to be Judge Higgins. I was very thrilled to have the DBE, but I just wanted to line myself up with the rest of the bench. I mean, we do have these strange things in England that no one abroad understands, and I would say 95% of the British public doesn't understand.
No. Very interesting. Well, Dame Rosalyn, I'm wondering whether we should break at this point.
Would you like a cuppa now? My husband even brought in some biscuits. He brought in bourbons. When I used to walk home from school, from Burlington Grammar School, and Mother would always be there with a cup of tea and a bourbon biscuit.
Oh, lovely.
Even somehow during the war years, I don't know where she got bourbons from, but she did. And I learned to speak French. I have very good French. I learned to speak French at an early age because my grandparents were Belgian.
Right.
And we didn't know what had happened to them in the war in Belgium, being Jewish, and we just didn't know. And so it must have been an awful time for my mother, just not knowing if they were alive or dead or anything. And we'll go and sit at the other end with our tea in a minute. And so she said, well, if they are alive and if we all meet up after the war, I want you to be able to talk French with them. And she had in a French professor called Monsieur, no, he was actually a Belgian professor called Monsieur Lambert. Where she discovered him, I don't know. And he would come, I can see the book we worked through, thick grammar book. He was obviously a very good teacher. And it was wartime, and these things were hard to come by. And he was, in my mind's eye then, an old gent. Whether that meant he was 40 or what, I don't know. But in my mind's eye, he was 70-ish or something like that. And now I don't think that's an old gent. And she would put out on the plate 2 bourbons, and when she left the room, he took both.
Continuing,
Yeah.
Dame Rosalyn, with your time at the ICJ.
Yes.
This is from 1995, when you were appointed to the court.
Yes.
And you retained this position for 11 years, when you then became the president. And I wonder if you can describe the circumstances of your appointment. You did touch on it earlier, but...
Well, I think it's invidious to talk about other possible people, isn't it?
Yes.
I don't especially want to do that. Is that all right?
I understand.
Yes.
Yes.
But the way... Yes, lean forward. The way these things work is there are what are called national groups. Those are the groups who nominate candidates, and those persons get registered at the Permanent Court of Arbitration on the International Court site, and that group can be made up any which way according to how the country wishes. And in our country, we don't have a Foreign Office representation on. In the States, the legal advisor is on, but we have senior presiding judge, who at that time was Lord Gough, senior law lord, and traditionally the last legal advisor but one, not the current one, but the previous one, and the sitting national judge, so in my case that was Robbie, and a leading academic. Wondering who that was. Maybe it was Ellie. I'm trying to remember who that might have been at the time. And so they all meet, and their task, excuse me, is not only to nominate when there's a vacancy, their proposal for the new British judge, but also as to whether they'll add their voice to other nominations around the world. So you have to know all the personalities and how they've been doing. So I'd obviously known I was in the frame,
Yes.
but there were a couple, 2 or 3 other people to whom it could very reasonably have gone. So I was very thrilled when I got Robert Goff's letter. But that doesn't get you to the court, that gets you nominated. And then the General Assembly of the UN and the Security Council vote on nominations. I mean, there are 15 seats at the court, and 1/3 of them come up at any given time. So you're talking about a very small number of seats being available. And sometimes, of course, a judge will be standing again, a sitting judge. And they really have a head start in staying put, you know. So I remember being out there for the election. That was very exciting. It came through with a very good result. People were very kind.
In an interview with Otto Spakers in 2011, you said, and I quote, "I think of myself as a liberal judge," and I wonder if you could explain how you see that, what that means.
Well, I think people generally are very conservative or very liberal by instinct. I think it has to be more than instinctively one way or the other. It has to be intellectualized within the framework of the law. But I think my inclinations are to find things are possible, if one can, rather than impossible, and always, to have in mind the people you're trying to benefit with what you're doing. I suppose that's the best way I could answer.
Thank you. And still coming back to the interview that you had.
I don't remember this interview at all. If you found it, I guess I did it.
This was a question about the court citing scholarly work.
Yeah.
And you said that the court traditionally cited its own jurisprudence, but that you thought in recent years it had become more outward-looking.
And I gather that's even more so now. I still think it's nervous about citing scholars overly. I mean, there are so many wonderful scholars around the world, all said and done. But the court does now much more look at judgments of other courts, both national and international. That was never done when I arrived at the court. I mean, the court has become a more liberal and less pompous place over the years. And, we regarded ourselves as it, but now we realise there are a lot of judicial bodies doing very useful and good work.
In your 2009 book, you pose the concept that there is an essential and unavoidable choice to be made between the rules and the policy notions of international law.
Yes.
Did you feel, Dame Rosalyn, that this ever introduced perhaps an element of uncertainty into the judicial process?
Well, I don't, because conservative people, will say that once you move away from rules towards policy relevance, you're introducing uncertainty. But the fact that a case ever gets to the court means that there isn't a plain forward. You don't litigate about are there 15 members of the Security Council. It's only the arguable points of law, or both as to content and as to their applicability in the particular circumstances, that leads to litigation. And so I believe those who say, and the clear rule is, are simply kidding themselves. They're choosing one possible norm over another, and I think it is much better to articulate openly what the possible choices are, the policy factors, and why international law should go one way rather than another in the particular case.
Right. So your time on the court would have overlapped with Judge Schwabel when he was president.
Yes.
Do you have any memories of his...
very much so. I mean, he'd been preceded by President Bejawa, and there were undeniable tensions there, and I thought Steve Schwabel would make an admirable president, and he did, and he was open-minded and so fair and courteous to everyone. Yes.
I gather that from his interview, it's clear that he enabled lots of physical improvements at the court with regard to, for example, facilities for secretarial support, canteen and so on.
He did. I mean, it seems funny to say it of him, but he was really a terrific trade union representative, you know. He was always badgering the UN for better facilities for this, that and the other, and he got the money for the extension of the court building at the back, so there was proper judges' quarters, and what was a canteen but is now a rather smart restaurant to which anyone at any of the courts may come. It's lovely. Some judges from another court can pop in for lunch and use it. And secretaries, that had happened when I arrived. Every judge had a secretary, but before then I believe there was a pool. He did a great deal of that sort of thing.
Did you feel that when you became the president you were able to build upon his legacy?
In a different way. I mean, when I became president, there were things about which I'd already been speaking on those occasions. I was still occasionally writing articles. I knew the court needed to be modernized in terms of its work and to be able to do more than it did. It was a sort of rather leisurely body when I arrived there. But of course, as the Cold War ended, the court became used more and more and more. And we had to keep up with the pace and deliver to the client. So that was one thing. Second thing was that other courts and tribunals had arrived on the scene. For years, the International Court had been the only international body, but now not only did we have other courts such as Strasbourg and Luxembourg, but right there in The Hague, we had the Yugoslav Tribunal and the Rwanda Tribunal, and very recently the International Criminal Court. And we had to learn to have an efficient, friendly relationship with them. And then, and this is sort of rather internal, I think we'd been through a period of I think on standing on our high horse with the Dutch authorities, and I wanted to rebuild good relations with the Netherlands, and I do think I was able to do all three of those during my 3 years. So they're very different from what Steve did, but they were what I thought was needed at my time.
And so your main responsibilities as president of the International Court were... Could you comment on what the main responsibilities are for the president?
Yeah. You obviously have to maintain the high caliber of the court judgment, I don't think there's ever been a period where people have said, oh, this is sloppy stuff, isn't it? I mean, they've always been well regarded, and it's really important they should remain that way. You have to make sure that good drafting teams are chosen. You have to guide the discussions after the oral hearings. You draw up a list of what the key points are. People are invited to add to them, and then the court members go away and study their notes and the scripts, and then write what is called a judge's note, but is essentially a draft judgment, but without footnotes and all of that, on these various points. And then you have to, in a very fair way, preside over the discussions on these, and at the end you have to be able to say, well, I think on this point we've got a majority, haven't we? And on that point, let's face it, we're so divided that if we don't need that point in the judgment, let's try and go another way. You have to be able to do that sort of thing, you know.
Fascinating. So you were involved in 60 cases overall?
Was I?
Yes. And I wondered what you recalled as your most taxing and difficult case.
Was that a great deal? Generally, or as president? Or both?
Shall we say as both?
Yes. I mean, as president, there's no doubt it was the series of Yugoslav cases. They were inherently, fearfully difficult problems on the breakup of Yugoslavia and all the legal questions we were being asked by various of the new component states of what had been the former Yugoslavia. And I have to be a little discreet here. There was a judgment in 2004 under the presidency of Judge Shee, on which the court split 8-7, and I was in the minority and very active in writing the minority opinion. And then when that had an impact on the cases that were to follow, because you can't say, well, there's a new person in now, none of that matters. And yet I didn't want to follow the conclusion that would have, I think, flown from that, which was saying, sorry, we can't help you. So finding the way through on that was really, really difficult.
Interesting.
Leading horses to the water, I didn't care what they said, but I did want them to drink, and they did eventually.
Gosh.
And then generally, I of course, I arrived, it was literally my second case during the advisory opinion on the use or threat of nuclear weapons, and that of course was a real hot potato. And the trouble is, when you arrive somewhere, the junior judge starts off in the discussions, so that's fearfully daunting. So yes, that stays very much in my mind.
Very interesting. What were the highlights of your presidency?
Well, achieving those objectives, I think when I left we had really good relations with my first official assignment. I took myself off to Itlos in Hamburg to pay them a visit. I think they were totally stunned, and I tried always to do that sort of thing after, to build good relations between the courts, because some judges previously had said, why is this new court coming? We can deal with all the issues they're dealing with. So I deliberately set out to do that, and I think we did finish up with good relations all around, and we found a way to use. It's hard to explain shortly, but we didn't want to do everything again that the Yugoslav tribunal had done, but you couldn't just agree with everything they'd done, so one had to find complicated ways of deciding what you could pick up and what you'd leave alone to start over with. So I think we found our way through that. We certainly finished up well again with the Dutch, the Dutch authorities, instead of having been told by my predecessor not to accept the invitation of the mayor. I said, as an invitation in from the mayor, I expect every member of the court to be there. So there were these turnarounds. Yeah.
So you retired from the presidency after 3 years?
Yeah, that's the normal period.
Right. And you, during the time that you were in the presidency, your book, Themes and Theories, was published. And so I'm just wondering about how did you manage that?
The honest answer is I had one of the best decisions I made, and let me start this sentence at the beginning. Normally everything in a house works according to a certain way, but the one thing in which the newly elected president has a freedom is to choose his or her personal assistant, judicial personal assistant. And I had a very good intern. Now the court has clerks, but when I was there they were interns, called Philippa Webb, and I sent her out a message saying, I don't know where you are, Philippa. She was Australian. I thought, probably in Australia, is there any chance you can come and talk to me about some possible work to help me? And it turned out she was the special advisor to the prosecutor in the new International Criminal Court. So she was just up the road. And I mean, I don't know how I would have managed without her. She was so helpful administratively and in terms of legal research, everything. And she really made that book possible.
I wondered...
She was absolutely terrific. And I mean, I wrote, I've always done my own writing, but in terms of, getting the permission from journals for republications, yes, and all of those things.
Yes, administration.
She was super.
Yes.
Super.
Still on the ICJ in general, in your Themes and Theories book, in the section 9, Writing on Judicial Matters, it's called the Judicial Years, you say that when writing on judicial matters, and this is page 1037.
Now you sound like the President Peter Topka, who remembers every page, every paragraph of everything ever written. Yes.
You said that you had to keep views of world affairs to a minimum and also avoid writing on difficult points of law. You could only write reflective pieces, and I wonder whether, since you've retired from the court, this constraint has been relaxed, or whether you still feel these parameters when you are writing.
Well, I'm not quite sure what I meant by things. When I say difficult points of law, I meant going off beam from a case and opining on this and that,
yeah,
which we had one or two judges who were wont to do. And I believe you, as a judge, should not opine on anything except when counsel have had a chance to argue in front of you and the other side come back on it. Otherwise, you should keep your thoughts to yourself. That was that point. What was the other point in it?
I wondered whether you felt that since retiring from the court, you feel that these constraints have become relaxed, or whether you still feel that you need to operate in that way.
Well, firstly, I'm trying to be retired, not wholly successfully, but I am trying. I'm really trying not to give lectures. The writing I do is what I would call this is meant to be an Oppenheim on United Nations law. That's going to take many, many years. A real practitioner's book on the UN, which Robbie and Arthur Watts asked me if I would do. Generally these days I say no to arbitrations, no to advice to government, no to lectures if I can, no to conferences, but I've retained 3 institutional linkages: the American Society, of which I've just finished a couple of years as honorary president, the British Institute of International Comparative Law, of which I am the president, so that's an ongoing and rather more active thing, and the Institut de Droit International, on which again I've just finished up 2 years as vice president. When I have a post, I like to do something with it, and I've tried to use those 2 years to have a modern instead of an antiquated voting system within the Institute, and I think we've achieved that. But so the writing thing doesn't really come up for me as an issue. The sorts of writing I do now is, the American Journal asked me would I do a long review on Ellie's book on his father. So of course I said yes.
Right. Yes.
Or I was asked to do the memorial of Peter Koyman's funeral, the Dutch judge, a great friend of mine. So it's that sort of writing now, and this
monumental task. Yes. I'd like to take a photograph of this. Dame Rosalyn, still coming back to your 2009 book, and I give the page number so that listeners to the interview can locate it. You write that in your Blackstone lecture, soon after joining the court, you write of its efficiency being hampered by what you call excessive deference to the entitlements of sovereign states. And
that I think is one of the more important lectures, pieces of writing I did. It was before I became president, but it was already apparent to me that the court was not working at full capacity and could do better. And the part of the problem, part of it, was this excessive deference to the fact that the parties before you were states. So there was the feeling among most at the time that we can't ask them to make their pleading shorter. They're states. They can say what they want to say, or constantly rules of procedure were being broken, but you didn't say anything because they were states. And I was already, by the time of the Blackwell lecture, longing to be able to change that.
Yes.
And now I think there is a very hard-working court, very hard-working, and that's continued under subsequent presidents, and they have a heavy caseload, and
Interesting.
And they know now that states have to accept they can't do everything they want, because there are other states waiting on the list for their case to come on. And they're sovereign too.
Yes. Apropos the issue of dissenting or separate opinions in the ICJ judgments, again this is page number 1038.
I said, yes.
Are you implying that this concept is as a result of a common law influence on the court's methods?
Well, apparently it is. I mean, it's just not known to the civil law system.
Yeah.
But I mean, it's been there forever, and it mostly works okay, but inevitably, in any period of time, there are one or two judges who think a separate or dissenting opinion is... A dissenting opinion should, in my view, not be what you would have done.
Yes.
You should merely, I think, say why you can't agree with what has been done, and a separate opinion should not be a long academic article.
Yes. Which brings us to your dissenting opinion, which you have mentioned, on nuclear weapons. And the text of this is reproduced in the 2009 book, page 1029 to 1138. And I just wondered whether your judgment, your dissenting opinion, does not point to a tacit agreement with Professor Allett's views that you cannot have laws for this kind of thing, for what he calls mass murder and indiscriminate destruction of property.
Not at all. No. Judge Vereshchagin, in his opinion there, he writes that there is a lex lata, there is a gap in the law there, and we just haven't yet reached the time to have laws on such things. And I felt, and I think I may have said there, but I've certainly said subsequently, I think, that no, because law is a way, international law, of making decisions, you've always got the tools to answer a particular problem, even if you can't pull out of the drawer a prior decision on that problem. So I don't agree with Philip's views that there are topics on which you can't answer. I would certainly agree that the fact there can be, in my view, a legal answer to every legal problem does not necessarily mean you're on your way to better international relations or better compliance. That I don't think.
And finally, before we leave your time at the ICJ, what are your overall memories of your time there?
Well, it was a very happy and fulfilling time for me. I love The Hague, which is why I still live there for a considerable part of each year. There were some very good friends among my colleagues, each of whom was interesting. The issues that come up are always so fascinating. You do feel working on that incredible site, just so privileged each day to be coming to work at the Peace Palace in the gardens with the pond, all the creatures on the pond. Just really, they were blessed years. The time as president was undoubtedly very, very challenging. Yes. In my more frivolous moments, I used to tell students getting 14 prima donnas to agree is quite difficult. The implication that I'm not one. But they're people with strong views and very clever. And a lot of politics does flow through these cases, and everyone comes with their own background and way of seeing things.
Yes. This brings us to your published work, and will it be fine to continue with this?
Yes, if you're game, I'm game.
Thank you. I've had to be selective because of your great output and my very limited knowledge, so I've chosen 5 books, and the first one was your 1963 Development of International Law for the Political Organs, and this was very well reviewed. Derek Bowett was very complimentary. He said that it was the best treatment of self-determination that he'd read, and I wondered on this issue whether your views on the subject have altered at all since then.
Self-determination?
Yes.
That's quite interesting, because I've just been having an exchange with the director of the British Institute of International Comparative Law. I mean, of course I don't remember so clearly what I said then, but I think they probably have not. I think what the Human Rights Committee did on self-determination, I think was always in line with the correct thinking on it. So I think there's a lot of people who have misconceptions about self-determination.
Otto Schachter is also praises very highly your book, and he highlights what he says are your views that the test of legality is not so much the semantic links to the Charter as the actual practice and behaviour of states. Hence, a single interpretive resolution in the UN, even if widely supported, is not necessarily the law, and what future behaviour may have to demonstrate whether or not it expresses an accepted norm. Was this a fair interpretation of your views then, and if so, do you still hold them?
Yes, no, I think that is right. The written texts are absolutely important starting point, but you have to look and see whether it was just, let's get something out of this meeting and all go home, or whether the evidences are there that states believe that to be the correct statement of the law.
And Mr. Schachter also mentions that Professor Jennings said that perhaps there should be a new category of source where there is no need for custom or time-honoured practice. So if a single case embodied a legal position so strongly and obviously, and I wondered if this new category has ever developed.
I don't think so. Specific cases are not precedents in the normal term in the court. It's not like in the Court of Appeal you must follow what the Supreme Court said, and we don't feel obliged to follow what we said unless it's absolutely on point, the same points you've got in front of you, and then, as we've had occasion to say in the Yugoslav cases, then if you're departing, you've really got to show why you're departing. But I don't see the need for any new categories or anything like that, no.
Finally, Otto Schachter says that you used an abridged form of the McDougall technique to present your issues. And I know that you acquired this at Yale, and that it is something that has persisted throughout the years. Would you say that it has evolved into your own technique rather than it's evolved from the McDougall technique?
I think it's easier for others to see if that's so. I think it may be largely a linguistic and presentational thing. I mean, as I've said to you before, it really was possible for everyone to understand Mac, but to go through the pages and pages of things you had to tick off and check against, is really tiresome, honestly. But what I've done is to try and keep really in focus the key elements of the policy science approach to international law, and to bring them to bear. So I think Oscar was right in saying from the start I didn't say, and then there are the 10 points to be addressed, and then there are the 15. I never did that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Dame Rosalyn, if you wrote that book today, has the UN altered so much that you would need to alter any significant conclusions?
Well, it's changed so much, and I would need 10 assistants now. It's hard to think in advance. I suspect the treaty section has probably changed a lot, of what goes on in the legal office. It's simply not up to date on that. There's a lot of borderline practice now on issues of statehood. That's changed somewhat. The use of force, there's now, the authorised uses of force by states or not, all the disputes on that. It would have to be quite, not different, but an awful lot would need checking out, yeah.
That brings us to the second book that I've had a chance to look at, published in 1965, Your Conflicts of Interest, International Law in a Divided World. This is very readable, and I wondered for whom it was written.
I think I was just approached by Bodley Head with the topic and to say, would I do it? And at that time, of course, the socialist world took the view, really the Soviet Union took the view, that there was one body of law that governed all the socialist states, and then you better have a method for coexisting peacefully with all the other states whose superstructure would crumble and who would, in the fullness of time, become Marxist. So I think that was a snapshot in history.
Yeah.
I don't think it has anything to do with, just because some of the same players were in it, I don't think it tells you anything about today's problems of the Ukraine and Russia and so on, the Crimea. But it was done at the request of Bodley Head.
Right. Written while you were at Chatham House. Was it for you something of a sort of light relief as you were ploughing through all the UN documentation?
No, it was an additional chore. And I was just entering the period of my life when you're apt to take things on, and you're just getting to the period of life that you've got to learn to start saying no.
Oh. And 2 weeks after handing in your manuscript, Khrushchev was ousted, and to some extent your assumptions were perhaps thrown up into the air.
Maybe.
This brings us to your UN peacekeeping documents and commentary. There were 4 volumes, and these have been extremely well received. Apropos style, Nelson, in his review, praised very highly your systematic coverage. You had 12 categories for each UN operation, and also your technical dependability. And he says you did not indulge in any revisionist history, just the facts. Also, Professor Bowett said it was an excellent commentary, and presumably this was your deliberate policy so that the volumes would stand the test of time and never become politically dated, forever relevant?
I mean, yes, that's what lawyers have to do, isn't it? If people, it's very pleasing to hear that everyone working on peacekeeping in the UN Secretariat still has these, although the world of peacekeeping has changed so enormously. But no one's interested in your views on a particular thing. Just get all the data out there, make it available, explain what the quarrels were. But for example, if I take the expenses case, or if I take the question of the call from Egypt for the UN force to withdraw, I was not interested in saying the rights and wrongs of that. I was saying, here were the issues, this is the way they were handled, here was the position of the parties.
You mentioned the certain expenses case, Volume 3, Chapter 11, with Russia and France's refusal to pay, deals with this very well. This matter, of course, had great importance outside considerations of peacekeeping, and resolution to the impasse was achieved only by, as one reviewer puts it, Cherry Hopkins, a great act of appeasement by the United States. Now, in retrospect, do you think that this act of appeasement was worthwhile?
That's a difficult one. I think it may have been inevitable because there are always going to be more members who don't want to pay than do. So I don't think you would ever have got the desired result. But I can understand why Cherry says what she does.
So David Wainhouse called your writing of Volume 1, The Middle East, a labour of love. Was it?
Yes. A very burdensome labour of love.
Looking back over the decades of UN peacekeeping, for example, the Balkans and the continued Turkish occupation of Cyprus, do you think that UN peacekeeping activities have had a lasting and real and beneficial effect?
I think they've definitely had a second wind. I was writing at the time of the Balkans saying the UN's really lost its way, and things that should be Chapter 7 action states really didn't have the guts for that and were talking about robust peacekeeping to do some of the same things, and there was a terrible, terrible price in the Balkans. But now, of course, although peacekeeping can't solve problems, it can certainly ameliorate, and in the many, many, many instances it's used now, there's a respectful and appreciative talk of the value of getting UN peacekeepers in.
In the introduction to Volume 3, Africa, which contained just the one case history, Congo, you said it was by far the hardest to prepare, and you cite the complex politics in the events as well as the vast ONUC documentation. It's just very hard to imagine how, without this documentation, any student could have worked their way through these materials without your volume.
Well, you're right. I really hope that's been the case and useful, and of course a lot of things changed with or developed with ONUC, including the use of force by the UN in certain circumstances and so on. But of course there's been an enormous amount of peacekeeping since. I mean, I hope my books are still of some use, but in another way they're very dated. There's been so much else, but there are good authors out there offering information on these other subsequent peacekeeping activities.
For the unearthing of this documentation, did you manage to do that? I mean, did you have to go to the United Nations?
I certainly did some by going to the United Nations and talking to those with whom I'd made good contact when I was an intern. And others I just ploughed through. But those years were years that were nearer to the beginning of the UN than now. I mean, now you just couldn't do that. Not without 10 researchers. I did that without any help at all.
It is unbelievable. Bearing in mind the large number of more recent UN operations, were you ever tempted to cover later years?
Absolutely not.
That brings us to your problems and processes, which again...
Process in the singular, problems and process.
Problems and process.
Yeah.
Thank you. International Law and How We Use It, published in 1994, and again the reviews were very praising. Kinsella, who was one of your students, says that the book is a series of interrelated perspectives on difficult areas of international law. And Prater wonders how the key problems were chosen. Were these issues in fact based on the important lecture topics that you gave and the problems that these threw up?
Yes, is the short answer. Yes, that's certainly so. And then I, built in it and thought more about it.
All the reviewers comment on the fact that your approach to international law is through a policy science view rather than rule-based. Is it possible to summarize your views?
I've slightly alluded to it before.
Yes.
In the view of some black letter lawyers, there are rules that you find in treaties or qualified extent in prior case law or in custom when you've identified it, and the job of the international lawyer is to locate that and apply it. Well, firstly, as I've said, I think it's perfectly understandable for a State Department or Foreign Office lawyer to remember who their client is and to put up the best arguments for applying it in a certain way. For the academic, the duty is different, but I think that rules, there's a very, very limited number of rules. Rules are things that simply cannot be gainsaid, and it's not much of that in international law. So, even the use of force is prohibited. Well, there's self-defense, So almost everything you could say to me, there's another thing. And the job of the international lawyer is to be aware of that, to look at the facts of the present case and the policy issues involved, and to find the preferred and better answer in that case. Yes. That's it in a nutshell, the best I can do.
Thank you. Interestingly, Sohn, whom I believe was at the LSE with you at the time that he wrote the review, says that he detected a shift in your attitude between the 1963 and the 1994 books, specifically on what for you were the criteria for determining when UN actions or resolutions became law. In 1963, he said, you were very clear that resolutions and how states had responded to them were focal points of a state's views, and hence custom. But he says that by 1994, your criteria were broader, emphasizing the whole process, views, positions, treaties and declarations, as well as resolutions. Is this true, Dame Rosalyn? And if so, was it because of how the UN operates, rather than a change in your ideas?
Well, I've never, of course, once ideas do develop, but I've never noticed or perceived that. I mean, there are two different issues, aren't there? One is, are UN resolutions binding? And by the way, there's a paragraph in the 1996 advisory opinion on nuclear weapons that sets out beautifully the court's view, the correct view on the circumstances in which assembly resolutions may be said to be binding because of the background to them. But in his second observation, Louis Sohn seems to be talking about what makes up law, and those broader things come into the question of what makes up law, whereas I think earlier I was talking about were resolutions of the Assembly binding, which was a much narrower question.
Yes. Louis Sohn, as well as Bilder and Wolfram, comment on your approach to human rights in international law, in particular their universality. And this is supposed to set them apart from culture, religion or politics. And you talk of rights which involve state abstinence, for example torture, and state obligation, but you draw the line at third generation and fourth generation rights. And you say that there should be no political and cultural relativism, and this is backed perhaps by the East-West capital socialist clashes in the 1990s.
Well, I still think that human rights are human rights, and in all of my teaching with Peter Duffy and otherwise, and my writings on human rights, you have to keep the focus on the idea of rights. And students at the beginning of the year in a human rights class, I could see they came from all over the world. I would say, I don't want you can tell me what you like in class, but I don't want to hear you just mouthing your government's point of view. I want you to be thinking. And then on your broader point, the day that a student says to me, no imprisonment without trial is fine, I don't mind that at all because I come from such and such a country. That's rubbish, isn't it? If you look at it from the point of view of the person concerned, the rights are universal. We've got, talking about cultural relativism is thinking about governments.
And this is a position that you have maintained throughout.
Yes, very firmly.
Yes. We come now to the last book, which is your Themes and Theories, and published in 2009. Huge number of fascinating issues, so obviously again
It's
I've
really
had to be
gathering
selective.
together of everything.
Wonderful volumes.
Yeah.
And you open the book with an instructive narrative of your CV, which formed the text of your address on the acceptance of the Balzan Prize. And I wonder if you could just recount what this award was for and the circumstances of that lecture.
Well, the Balzan Prize really is a marvellous thing to be lucky enough to get. It is a Swiss-Italian foundation, and and Balzan himself was an Italian newspaper publisher who did very important and brave things in the war. And then he set up this prize, and the prize sums are really, one has to say, remarkable. And it's also a family. I mean, I have found out since that once you've had the prize, you get all sorts of correspondence from, please come and be with us on this and that. Last year they invited me to a seminar to be given by another prize winner on town planning issues. I learned a great deal, and there's a continuing family embrace there, which is very special, I think. And the prize itself, which, as I've said, is very, very generous, half of it you are committed to use for a research project in which you are leading young people in your field and bringing them on in that area. And I am able, thanks to Balzan, to have 4 young people helping with this. I do not know how I could have begun to think about this volume otherwise. So it's been a blessing to me, and I think very exciting for them.
Yes. Thank you. Ray, or apropos international petroleum law, page 694, you talk, and I quote, of the heady days and the excitement. What were these?
Oh, they were, of course, in the early to mid-70s, when North Sea oil was just about coming on stream, and there were all the huge legal problems that hadn't been thought of before, and then the bombshell where that period, the Labour government of the day decided that it wanted a majority share in everything, but of course all the investment had come from the private parties till that moment. And I used to give that as an example in my natural resources course. We look at all these third world countries, but we're doing that as well. But we have the resource. Everyone who has the resource does these things, and finding solutions to that, and the famous no win, no loss formula. It was exciting, yes.
Must have been. Sir Eddie Lauterbach told me that his first big case was the 1954 consortium negotiations involving nationalisation of Anglo-Iranian oil, BP. And I wondered if he ever spoke to you about this.
Well, yes, and there's, of course, a lot about it in his book on his father. It sort of comes up on the side. But yes, Ellie and I have talked about a lot of things over the years, and I've always benefited from that. Still
on your 2009 book, you were part of an interview with the US Secretary of State, Condoleezza Rice. It's a fascinating account. And the discussion about the US Supreme Court citing international law and what the Congress calls foreign law, and the anger that was generated in Congress. And I wondered whether you found this somewhat disturbing. Justice O'Connor said that even from the early days the Supreme Court acknowledged the law of the sea and so on.
And this has been a long-standing American perspective. In recent years, obviously, underscored with the composition of the court, the more conservative composition in recent years. And then there's been the additional complication that even when the Supreme Court would be minded to put in place a judgment of the International Court of Justice, they can't, they have said, override the views of the states on an issue. So, and then, the Congress would have to overturn the law, but law that's traditionally been in the hands of the states. It is all tremendously complex.
Yes.
For us in the UK, it's rather simple.
Right. Still, the same interview, you said that the United States commitment to human rights treaties was usually late and qualified, which made natural allies a little hesitant in perceiving the United States' clear leadership.
Yeah.
And the Secretary of State, Condoleezza Rice, said that it was because their culture is profoundly different. Why do you think this is?
Well, I think there is in that culture a great distrust of foreigners, of foreign thinking, of arrangements where others may decide the law over your heads, even if the contents of that law something you fully agree with. So you take something like the Genocide Convention. There's never been a moment in history where the US thought genocide was lawful, but they came extremely late to accepting the convention.
Right.
I think those are the sorts of factors.
Yes. In your piece, the Rule of Law lecture for 2007, and I just give the page number for readers, 1330, you compare with Dicey's domestic criteria, that there's no world parliament, equality before law, and so on. No hierarchy of courts, so fragmentation and no coordination. Domestic rule of law has no international analogue, and you say that the subject of international rule of law is important at the UN, but that it means all things to all people when long-standing projects of national interest are being repackaged as rules of law issues.
I still think that's right. Everyone's meant to be extremely pro-rule of law, yes, but one has to be hard-headed and realise that in the UN those words do mean different things to different people and often relate to particular things going on in their mind in relations to other states.
Just a few general international law topics, and this is the first one concerns fragmentation, and this is an issue which you address in your 2009 book. And I had the privilege of interviewing Marti Koskiniemi in 2009, and you say, Dame Rosalyn, that apropos teaching international law at the LSE on general versus specialist subjects, that in every area of international law there are simply too many of them to be covered. Did you see this splintering of the subject as something for concern, as did Marti Koskiniemi? What he spoke of his grave concern for the fragmentation and the managerialism of international law.
I wonder if we're talking about the same thing. I believe that it's up to each university to decide if its shareholders will be just specialists in a particular area, or must be generalists, but with exceptional knowledge in particular areas. And I think, the Oxford, Cambridge, the LSE have always taken the latter view. That being said, we can't all know absolutely everything. I mean, I don't pretend today to know much about space law. I'm sure if a case had come in while I was at the court, knowing how to apply principles to particular problems, I'd have managed to get on top of it. But it's no good asking me today, will you come to a student moot on space law? I don't know enough about it. That's not to me a fragmentation. It's a reality.
Yes.
You can't cover everything. Sometimes a GP has to send for a specialist,
Yes.
But fragmentation, I had understood, was about different courts and tribunals, of which there are now so many, taking an understood theme of international law and giving divergent answers. And as you've probably understood, I have written and spoken and spoken at the UN in my presidential addresses to the theme that this isn't really much of a problem, that there is a big understanding that we all need to run along parallel lines. There is an understanding that so far as general international law is concerned, the international court, if it's pronounced, should really be followed unless there are absolutely exceptional reasons. And I think it's turned out to be largely a non-issue.
Thank you very much. Well, Dame Rosalyn, all that remains is for me to thank you very sincerely for a fascinating account, which I know will be of enormous interest to our readers. I'm extremely grateful to you, and I thank you again.
Thank you very much, and for all your hard work in what you've had to read.